For more than 70 years, the story of the Palestinian refugee problem has been told in two completely opposite ways. One story is all about flight, the other is all about force. But what if both of those stories are missing the point? In this explainer, we're going to dig into the explosive historical research that completely shattered decades of myths. So, for decades, this is how the story was told. When people asked how 700,000 Palestinians became refugees back in 1948, you basically got one of these two answers. Was it a voluntary choice, maybe even encouraged by their own leaders? Or was it a systematic expulsion, a master plan carried out by Jewish forces? Each side had its own simple, clear-cut story to explain this incredibly traumatic event. And then, boom, in 1988, this book comes out and it drops like a bombshell. Benny Morris's The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem didn't just pick a side. Instead, it used newly opened archives to argue that the real story, well, it was way more complex and honestly a lot more troubling than either side had ever publicly admitted. This wasn't just another opinion piece. This was new evidence. So what was the secret sauce here? I mean, how could one single book challenge decades of entrenched national myths? The answer wasn't in finding a new argument. It was in the archives. It meant going back to the original documents, many of which had been totally locked away from the public for nearly 40 years. You know, the book's impact was immediate. And this is why. It wasn't based on hearsay or political spin. As you can see here, its revelations were so startling because they came directly from the historical record. It forced both sides to look in the mirror and confront a history that challenged their most deeply held beliefs. And just look at the sheer range of these sources. We're talking Morris being one of the first historians to systematically go through all these newly opened Israeli military files, records from the Haganah, that was the main Zionist paramilitary group, plus British, American, and UN archives. This is the raw stuff, military orders, intelligence briefs, diplomatic cables that gave this unbelievable day-by-day view of the war as it was actually happening. So this deep dive into the archives put Morris in a group of scholars known as revisionist historians. Now, that's not a political label, it's really a historical method. It just describes historians who use new, fresh evidence to revise or challenge the established official histories that countries often tell about themselves. Okay, so if both of the simple stories were wrong, what did the archives actually show? Well, the answer was messy. The evidence revealed that the Exodus wasn't some single event with one simple cause. It was this chaotic, drawn-out process with a whole bunch of different and often overlapping reasons behind it. All right, let's just quickly set the stage. Before the war, this was the plan from the United Nations, right here on paper. They divide mandatory Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state, and Jerusalem would be this international zone. This was the proposed map back in November of 1947. And wow, this shows you the reality on the ground just over a year later. It shows nearly 400 Arab towns and villages that were depopulated during the war. So the huge question the book really gets into is, what on earth happened in the space between these two maps? Instead of one tidy answer, a single expulsion order from one side or a blanket call to leave from the other, the archives revealed this tangled web of factors. What happened in one village was often totally different from what happened in the village next door, and the reasons people left kept changing as the war dragged on. Okay, this table, which is pulled from the book's own analysis, just completely shatters that idea of a single explanation. The research actually tried to code the decisive cause for why each village was abandoned. And as you can see, it was a mix of everything. Direct military assaults, straight-up expulsions by Jewish forces, fear spreading like wildfire when a nearby town fell, psychological warfare, and yes, in a very small number of cases, abandonment on Arab orders. The reality was a chaotic mix of all of it. Now, this is a really crucial point from the book. While the evidence didn't show some single master plan for expulsion that was decided on before the war started, that does not mean expulsions didn't happen. Oh, they absolutely did. The documents show that as the war got more intense, expulsions became a more common tactic for local commanders. You could say the war itself created the logic for it. But the Exodus was really only the first part of the story. Because once the fighting stopped, a brand new question came up. Why couldn't the refugees just go home? This is how a crisis during a war became a permanent, multi-generational problem. So the book details this really clear three-step process. First, you have the chaotic exodus happening during the war itself. Then, starting around mid-1948, Israel's new provisional government made a series of conscious, deliberate political decisions to flat out bar the refugees from coming back. And finally, those decisions were basically set in stone on the ground by moving new immigrants into the abandoned homes and building new settlements on village lands. It made the whole situation permanent. And this brings us right up to the lasting legacy. Because the events of 1948, they didn't just stay in the past. Their consequences have echoed and grown through the decades, creating the situation we're still dealing with today. 700,000. I mean, just let that number sink in. In the span of about a year, more than half of the Arab population in the territory that became Israel had been displaced. It was a massive humanitarian crisis that completely reshaped the entire region. And over the decades, that original population just grew. By the time the book's revised edition came out, the number of registered refugees and their descendants had ballooned to around 4 million, and it keeps growing. As the book makes crystal clear, this unresolved question, the fate of millions of people, is still one of the biggest obstacles to peace. So, the really crucial takeaway here is that this is not just ancient history. The complex, the multi-layered, and frankly, the tragic events of 1948 directly created what is maybe the most emotionally and politically charged issue right at the very heart of the conflict today. Ultimately, this kind of history forces all of us to trade in our simple, often self-serving myths for a much more complicated and uncomfortable reality. And it leaves us with a pretty difficult final question. What happens when the foundational stories a nation tells about itself are proven to be just that, stories?